Looking at women's employment and activism, settlement houses workers made up just a fraction of all gainfully employed women. With the rapid growth of the general population, the number of employed women increased, as did the percentage of women in the labor force. We really see the greatest leaps at women in the workforce coming in the 1880s and in the first decade of the 1900s. Looking at some of the numbers to give you an idea of the increased women's employment. So the number of employed women went from around 2.6 million in 1880 to 4 million in 1890, and then from 5.1 million in 1900 to 7.8 million in 1910. The employment of women in large numbers was the most significant event in women's history. And through all these years, domestic work remained the largest category of employment for women. Teaching and nursing also remained a large category, or remained among the leading fields for women employment. The biggest change came from clerical work. So you start to see women become more involved in the areas of bookkeeping, stenography, and then sales jobs became increasingly available to women. However, these changes I guess in the occupational status of women had little connection to the women's rights movement, which had increasingly focused on the issue of suffrage. Immediately after the Civil War, for instance, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton demanded that the 15th Amendment give the right to women as well as to black men. They refused to support the amendment, in fact, without such a change. And they also, I guess on a down note, or a little bit of a blemish, is they even stooped to racist arguments to support their cause. For example, in 1868, Stanton appealed to racism across America when she wrote in her suffrage newspaper, The Revolution, that women deserve the right to vote more than African American and immigrant men. And I quote Stanton here. She says, "Think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Young Tong," she advised readers. In her view, illiterate, ignorant men had no right to help elect politicians and help make laws affecting educated women. However, such arguments had little impression on the defenders of the men's prerogative, who insisted that women belong in that code of domesticity, or that separate female sphere. So, although denied voting rights, women became increasingly involved in the public sphere outside of the home. You start to see in the late 19th century women's organizations start to sprout up. These include church groups, book groups, women's clubs, mothers clubs, temperance societies, and they provided an active outlet outside the home. You also see, the settlement house movement could be an example of this as well. The largest and most influential women's organization was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, that was founded in 1874 and expanded throughout the country in the 1880s. And by 1890, the WCTU counted some 150,000 members. Most of these members were white, urban, and middle-class women. And although their name gives the impression that they were primarily against, stopping alcohol abuse, and the leader for prohibition, and for sure they were. They also focused on other areas of reform, like prison reforms, aid for homeless children, preschool education or kindergartens, sex education, aid to working women, and women's suffrage. In fact, it's said that the Women's Christian Temperance Union did more than any other organization to mobilize women in support of progressive social reforms. However, in 1869, there was a divisive issue which broke the unity of the women's movement. And this is the issue of women's suffrage, or more specifically, whether or not the movement should concentrate on gaining vote at the expense of promoting other women's issues. And you start to see a divide here within the women's camp. People like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they founded something called the National Women's Suffrage Association. And this promoted women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution, but they also considered gaining the right to vote as one of many feminist causes to be promoted. Later that year, in 1869, other activists formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, which focused single-mindedly on suffrage as the first and basic reform for women. Before they started promoting other progressive reforms, they said that the women needed the right to vote. It would be more than a half a century before this battle would be won, and the long struggle focused the women's cause ever more on the primary objective of the right to vote. In 1890, after 3 years of negotiation, these rival groups, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, decided to unite as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton as president for 2 years, followed by Susan B. Anthony as president of the association until 1900. Then after that, the work was carried on by a new generation of activists, notably Carrie Chapman Catt, who led that suffrage movement and other progressive social reforms for the women's movement into the 20th century. We'll talk more about the women's movement when we look at Woodrow Wilson. During the Progressive Era, I guess when we talk about Theodore Roosevelt and his presidency, even though he's considered as the first modern president and one of our progressive presidents, the women's rights movement really didn't gain a lot of support during his time as president. So we'll pick back up with the women's rights movement with Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and we'll talk about Carrie Chapman Catt again. We'll talk about people like Alice Paul. We'll talk about Margaret Sanger and birth control. We'll talk about the 19th Amendment. And just to kind of throw this out there, you know, when we're looking at women's suffrage and we're looking at the women's rights movement, it is important to note that before the 19th Amendment was passed, women did have the right to vote. In fact, you know, you had 9 Western states that gave women full suffrage by 1911. Now, it's not until New York in 1917 gave women the right to vote that a state east of the Mississippi granted women suffrage. But, you know, in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, it is important to note that the women were, you know, making significant strides in some areas, you know, specifically west of the Mississippi, in gaining that right to vote. But it won't be until that 19th Amendment is passed that we have universal female suffrage across the country. But despite that, you know, despite the focus on the vote, women did not confine their public work to only that issue. Some other issues that we saw women, you know, support. In 1866, we saw an organization be created, the Young Women's Christian Association, or the YWCA, a parallel to the YMCA, appeared in Boston and started to spread elsewhere throughout the movement, throughout the country. We also started to see, like I said, those book reading clubs, those literary clubs, or those women's social clubs that started to sprout up in the late 19th century, mostly consistent of white, middle-aged, middle-class or upper middle-class women. We do start to see, you know, women becoming aware of unfair labor conditions. You start to see organizations sprout up for that cause. We'll see the National Women's Trade Union League in 1903 being started, you know, getting middle-class women together for working women and for the benefit of women unionists. So we definitely see women taking an active part in other reforms rather than other than just the right to vote. So even without the support of voting women in most places, we do want to look at some things that the states were doing as far as reforms are concerned in the late 19th century. And by the late 19th century and into the 20th century, we start to see pretty much, you know, most states, or many states, are going to start regulating big business, working conditions. By the end of the 19th century, nearly every state had begun to regulate railroads. They had moved to supervise banks and insurance companies. And by one count, the states and the territories passed more than 1,600 laws between 1887 and 1897 relating to the conditions in the workplace. These are things such as limiting the number of hours required for workers, providing special protection for women, limiting or forbidding child labor, requiring that wages be paid regularly and in cash, calling for factory inspections. Nearly all states, for instance, had boards of or commissioners of labor. Some had boards for arbitration purposes. But still, even though we start to see states move towards reform in the late 19th century, we still saw that the conservative judges in such places as the Supreme Court limited the practical impact of these laws. For instance, just a example of this is that in thwarting some of these new regulatory efforts, the Supreme Court of this time, which was pretty conservative, used a revised interpretation of the 14th Amendment to limit the impact of some of these state reforms. And one of these things that we saw the conservative Supreme Court do is that they interpreted the 14th Amendment to include corporations. The judges reasoned that the word person in the due process clause, to deny any person the equal protection of the law, included corporations, and so they would use that and they would interpret that word person to make some of their rulings in the late 19th century that would actually support corporations and their right as quote-unquote people. And so we do see some state reforms, and we'll definitely want to come back to this issue with Wisconsin and Robert Lafayette, and we want to make sure that we make a note that the courts will change and become a little bit more progressive minded in the early 20th century. But just kind of noting here that since we're looking at the state and the local level and what's going on there, that we start to see states take some early efforts here to make some of these social reforms necessary, or to make these social reforms happen. But there's some obstacles that are still put into place that are going to slow down or going to limit the impact of these reforms. So the last topic we want to touch on will be that of the Muckrakers, these investigative journalists that sprouted up in the late 19th, early 20th century, and their whole goal was to raise public awareness and political action to try to solve some of these problems that we've been talking about. They got the nickname Muckrakers from Theodore Roosevelt. While he was president, he acknowledged that they were doing some good, and that he was glad that they were writing these exposés of social ills in these newspapers and these magazines. But he felt like these crusading journalists didn't know when to stop sometimes, and they were always focused on raking up this muck, and sometimes he felt like they went too far. And without the Muckrakers, these reform efforts of the progressive era would have never received this widespread popular support. But in feeding the appetite for the public's, or for feeding the public's appetite for these facts, the Muckrakers demonstrated one of the features of the progressive movement, and also one of its central failures, that the progressives were stronger on diagnosis than on remedy. And they thought that if they just got enough people to support a cause, then action would actually take place. And that this does happen sometimes. We do see out of these Muckrakers and out of their articles and their books that political action will take place. I guess as a whole, if you look at the number of articles written and the number of action, pieces of legislation actually put into place, there is a sense of imbalance there. That there was a lot more talk than there was action. We should do all this stuff, but then when it comes down to walking the walk, we don't see that that legislation put into place, or at least at the same in the same numbers as these articles being written about the problems that we see in politics and in society. Some notable muckrakers of the time period. Lincoln Steffens wrote the book The Shame of the Cities, talking about political corruption at the municipal level. Ida Tarbell wrote a series of articles that become a book called The History of Standard Oil, which will later be the leading cause for the Supreme Court to decide to dismantle Rockefeller's trust. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail in the next video series.